I am an immigrant to Canada, actually. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago and grew up as an only child of poor parents, really. My father was a tailor, my mother was a secretary, and they had a grade 8 education. We had been living in social housing until I was 13, and then they moved on and they rented a better place. But they always believed that education was the single most important thing that I needed if I was going to move out of where they were and into a better life. And so I studied hard, I had the ability to get good marks, and so eventually I came first on the island of Trinidad and Tobago in English literature, won a scholarship to do my master's at Oxford. Because my parents were not wealthy, they had been saving their money because they really wanted to have a little home of their own that they owned. But they wanted their daughter's education, so that money was saved for either or. And I found out that Shakespeare's tragic heroes, according to an Oxford professor, had psychiatric problems. Like Hamlet was manic depressive, and Macbeth was passive-aggressive, Lady Macbeth was obsessive-compulsive, etc. And I thought this was so intriguing, and I was telling my dad, whom I told everything to, I would like to be a psychiatrist. He talked to a family doctor who said, you can't be a psychiatrist. You have to be a doctor first, and to be a doctor, you have to do science. And of course, I had done English literature, French literature, Spanish literature, Latin, and geography and math, and I had no science, because I went to school with nuns, and they didn't think girls should do science. So I wasn't able to get into medical school, but my dad asked the family doctor to continue looking. He found a place in Ireland which was immediately at that time taking 10 students in their pre-med year for a period of 10 years because they wanted to find out whether medicine was an art informed by science or pure science. So they wanted to take people who had marks at the top of the bell curve in something other than science. And he set my marks and I got picked. My parents took the money for their house and they sent me to medical school. And so I always believed when I came to Canada in the Trudeau vision of a just society, a society where people should have those basic things like a secure roof over their heads, a good job, the dignity of being able to provide for their family, the opportunity that you get from having a good education. And so I liked the idea of that just society. I came here and obviously started to practice medicine. It was in my practice of medicine that I actually learned about people. You really don't get to understand people until you get patients, and patients taught me medicine, really. And I learned that you couldn't judge people from either their socioeconomic status or what they did with their lives, but in fact, about who they really were deep down inside. In about the 80s, late 80s, when HIV became the quote-unquote gay disease, and there was all that trouble in the United States and in California with discrimination, I had some patients who were gay, and I had been a little concerned always about the fact that my gay patients were always afraid for people to know who they are. That really came home to me with my first patient who died of HIV. He was a very young man, and I had known him since he was an adolescent, and he'd come from a very wealthy family in Toronto. He left Toronto. It was in Vancouver that he actually came out. And when he began to come out, he stopped seeing me as a patient. I think he felt, and he told me later on, that he thought I would be disappointed in him. And then one day I saw him sitting in my waiting room, and he had a huge rash all over his body, and he was sitting there with his files, and he came in and he told me his story. We did the test, and we found out he was HIV positive. In those days, patients didn't live very long with HIV, and he died very rapidly, but he also developed dementia very early. And I would go in to visit him in the hospital, and sometimes he'd know me, and sometimes he wouldn't. But what was sad was that his partner that he had been with for 11 years actually couldn't have a say in anything to do with him. That really taught me a lesson about how you can discriminate in society against people under the law and how it really impacts on every segment of their lives, whether it's access to care and whether it's dying with dignity. It was automatic that I was a liberal, I like to think anyway. So I was asked by Mr. Chrétien. I had just come off being president of the British Columbia Medical Association. I was very nationally known at the time, so Mr. Chrétien came and asked me if I would run. And I said no, because I said, why would I want to be a politician? Politicians are so like, ew, they kind of don't seem to have ethics. And he said, well, that's not true. He said, actually, you have to be a principled politician, and you can be. And there were many politicians who were principled and who went into politics to be able to do some good and for public service. So that was breakfast, and he didn't say anything. But 3 months later, he called me and asked me for lunch. And I still said no, I really wasn't interested. I was really happy with where I was. And then he asked me for dinner about 6 months later, and said that was the last time he was going to ask me to run. And he said, you're always talking about change, about change, about change. He said, how about instead of being on the outside, knocking on the door, why don't you come in and do make a difference there? Well, that was a seductive message for me. I went like, yes. But at the same time, it was again just coming out of the 80s and looking at all that discrimination I talked about earlier. And I said to him, I'll run on one condition, that you amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to add sexual orientation as a prohibited ground for discrimination. And he was true to his word, and we finally brought in the amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act, and out of that flowed modernization of benefits in which medical and dental benefits and the ability to have a say in your partner's decision-making and to have pensions. That changed with that piece of legislation. Going about getting equal rights for the LGBT community wasn't necessarily easy. There was a lot of backlash from, as I say, the Conservatives. But within our own caucus, the Liberal caucus, there was a pushback. I had worked very closely with the Vancouver community here, of the LGBT community. As we moved every step of the way, we kind of I was with them every step and explained to them how it had to be incremental as we moved forward and what they needed to do to help to push from the other side. When same-sex marriage passed, at the committee under Mr. Chrétien in 2003, a bunch of us just cried. We just couldn't, we just bawled our eyes out, because we realized that this was history and that we were there helping to make that history, and that was an extraordinary moment. And Mr. Chrétien was right. I got to get inside and change things. He did, it was the truth. And so I suddenly realized that indeed I had made a difference by being a member of Parliament to a whole lot of people in this country. We were a part of history. Even if, as Mr. Chrétien said to me, nobody remembers who we are 20 years down the road, we did it, and it was done, and it is there. I had been working ever since I became a member of Parliament with AIDS Vancouver, and we had moved forward looking at a parallel situation in which we could look at getting this, as I said earlier on, this money to put into a national AIDS strategy, a national HIV strategy that would go to community organizations to help them, to support, to educate, to do whatever was needed, and to look at a harm reduction policy. All of that was happening back in Ottawa with some of us while it was happening here in Vancouver. It was a big movement here in Vancouver with people like Blatherwick and Schechter and O'Shaughnessy. Everybody was pushing. Philip Owen, I have to give him credit, at the time was mayor, and he had traveled abroad. So he came back and said, I think we should be doing this kind of thing where we look at the drug abuse and the substance abuse within the downtown east side. And we started what was known as the Vancouver Agreement. Mr. Chrétien asked me, at the time I was in his cabinet still, and he asked me if I would take on that extra job of being the downtown east side minister, or the minister for the Vancouver Agreement. And it was an NDP government at the time, and Jenny Kwan was the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and she was the person designated. And of course, there was Philip Owen, who was just like a one-man show. And so the three levels of government got together, had a common objective, worked together, saying, this is what we do, this is what you do, this is what you do, there are gaps, let's fill them. And I have to tell you, we were three different political parties. It wasn't just that we were three different levels of government. And what came out of it was something important. The logical idea that if you wanted to achieve an objective, you had to be rowing in the same direction. Everyone just kind of did brought what they had to the table, and stopped a lot of costly duplication that had been going on until then. It was a success. As you know, Insight started a new way of looking at addictions, not as some kind of criminal activity, but looking at the people who were addicts as a public health problem, as a medical issue. It was a disappointment, of course, when we left government and the Conservative Party decided to challenge not only challenge the safe injection side, but take it to every single level until the Supreme Court, who, as you well know, ruled that while the federal government have a right to say that they don't want illegal drugs to be used, and have a right to say that therefore Insight was contravening that and was allowing illegal drugs to be used, the Supreme Court said under Section 15 of the Charter, the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person trumped everything any government can do.